I'm Mo, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar today. We're going to be talking about 4X and abstraction and game design. You know, when it comes to 4X, we always have that one more turn effect. So today we're joined by Ian Schreiber, senior game designer, who will, give us some information on how to achieve that. And, one of the things that we'll be getting out of this webinar is, thinking about games in an abstract manner, and then delving deep to sort of build the subsystems of your game. So introductions. I'm Mo. I'm a game designer, and I handle game design relations at Machinations. And I've worked on free-to-play mobile. I've also consulted on PC, indie, and console. So I'm super excited to be here, moderate the panel, and talk game design with you all. Ian, please give us an introduction.
I'm Ian Schreiber. I've been making games professionally for about 21 years now. I do a lot of systems design, game balance, like anything that involves math formulas and spreadsheets. That's the kind of stuff I love to do. I have not actually made a 4X game. I've just played a lot of them, at least not that I can talk about without breaking NDA. But I'm definitely... it's definitely an area of professional interest of mine. And as far as Machinations goes, we're going to be doing, pretty basic stuff in terms of building this thing. So, and analyzing the genre. So we're going to be doing okay.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm the evangelist for Machinations, and I'm going to be kind of supporting Ian today in hacking out some models and building out some models as we go along. Cesar, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Cesar. I'm a diagram craftsman for the team. Those of you that have seen our other webinars probably recognize my face. Today, me and Matthew are going to be pretty faces for most of the talk. So excited to see what's going to happen.
Awesome. So we should get started. I think we'll kick off super quick with, what was interesting for us is that Ian had just finished his new book, Game Balance. He mentioned Machinations in the book. And so, me and Ian have spoken previously outside of Machinations, and I reached out to him and I was like, we have an upcoming webinar. We'd love to have you there. What would you like to talk about? And he was like, since the book mentions abstraction and Machinations, we figured, why don't we talk about 4X? So Ian, please lead the way.
All right. So I'm figuring most people in the audience probably know what 4X games are. It was in the title of the webinar without explanation. But just in case there's anyone out there that is like, what is that? I came here from Machinations. I don't even know what 4X is, or I'm a little unclear about this. I'll just start by talking a little bit about, just what is this genre and then why are we doing this? So 4X is, the genre that I actually hate this name because it's not very descriptive, but on its own, it's more like, yeah, you know what we're talking about, wink, wink, right? It stands for explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So you've got some form of exploration. So there is a map, you are going through the map on its own. There's some form of fog of war where you do not know where everything is at the outset and you have to figure it out. Expand, meaning that you are building a network of cities or other kinds of nodes and building them up. Exploit, the idea that there are resources on the map that you can gather and then use in some way to build your empire. And exterminate, meaning there is some form of combat, there's some way to eliminate other players and fight with them on the same map. This was popularized by Sid Meier's Civilization series. Though there are many games, there are a lot that predate that. I think it goes all the way back to like 1980, the early 1980s. There were like a few games in there, if you've never played a 4X game, I'd say if you want a very brief, very simple entry point, there's a wonderful game on mobile called Polytopia. You can play that to completion in like under an hour. If you want a pretty short, full length 4X game, Civilization Revolution is the one that I always go to. That one plays from beginning to end in about 3 to 4 hours. It's pretty old by now, but it's still quite good. Most 4X games are like 20 plus hours per playthrough. And these are play kind of like board games in that you're playing from the beginning to the end, and then you're expected to play it again and again and again. So there's a lot of any player who is a 4X aficionado, that is probably one game in that genre is the game that they have like way more Steam hours on than any other game. Just because a single playthrough is so long and you're expected to do many repeat playthroughs. If you want recent examples, Civilization 6 is out there. And just in the past few months, we've had Old World, which was from Soren Johnson, who was on some of the earlier Civ games, and Humankind, another one. So those all just came out. I hate that there was a game called Old World that just came out, and there's a game called New World that's coming out soon that have nothing to do with each other. I was like, oh. Anyway, 4X games share a lot in common with turn-based strategy games like Advance Wars and all of those types of things, except those tend to be less complex. It's just with those, it's a series of short missions. Doesn't really have the exploit part. You just get money each turn, spend it buying more units, and then try and roll over your opponent. There's no real empire building elements. With 4X games, you are kind of building a growing empire. 4X also shares a lot in common with real-time strategy games, except those are played in real time. 4X games are generally turn-based. Because real-time strategy games are in real time, they tend to have much lighter strategic elements, and again, not so much in terms of exploiting and the environment. So again, the essential elements in 4X that you have to have, it's like if you don't have exploration on a map where you're discovering an unknown, then you're not really in 4X. So you kind of have to have that. You have to have the ability to build and upgrade some kind of city. They don't have to be cities specific on a planet specifically. Like there are a lot of 4X games that take place in space where you're building and upgrading planets. But you're building and upgrading some kind of node, usually choosing what to build next. Your cities usually allow you to build other things, either upgrades on themselves to make them more efficient, or building units that you can then use to exploit the map. And the other thing that's kind of really typical in 4X games is that you have multiple game loops going on simultaneously. So you've got an economic loop where you're building your economy and building up to like big numbers where you can then buy some big thing. You've got a military loop where you're building units, sending them out to attack something and take over a new city. You've got empire building where it's like, each of your individual cities is generally working on something that it's building to upgrade itself. You've usually got a tech loop of some kind where you're actually building out a tech tree, which then gives you more options in all the other areas. There's often other, those are kind of the loops that pretty much every 4X game has. And then they often include other ones. Diplomacy is a pretty common one where you can actually like work up with, and some have like more involved diplomatic systems than others. With some, it's like you can actually have like a diplomacy tree where you're building up to different kinds of policies with your neighbors. So it's not just about killing them off. It can be about allying and everyone getting ahead together. Religion is a common one to build in there where you've got some kind of other tree. And all these different game loops also often map to multiple victory conditions. So you can win by killing everyone else with your military, or you can win economically by like purchasing a big thing, or you can win through technology by like researching some really big tech at the very end, or. So there's usually multiple victory conditions. And this is what kind of, and the idea that there's multiple simultaneous game loops is what leads to that one more turn phenomenon. If anyone's ever played like Civilization and you've sat down at like 9 at night and been like, okay, I'll play a few turns of Civ, and then a few minutes later it's like 4 a.m, you're like, wow, what happened? Right, what happened is that every single turn, because there's all these different loops going on in motion at the same time, but they're not in sync with each other. So you're like one turn away from making a really big purchase, right, with your economic system. And then once you get that, it's like, oh, I got this big cool thing. And now but now I'm one turn away from building this military unit that I'm going to send into combat. But then after you finish that big combat, it's like, oh, I'm just one turn away from getting a new really cool tech. And so on. So it's like you're always just 1 or 2 turns away from at least some small thing, and it may be 3 or 4 turns away from some big thing happening, just because there's so many balls that you're juggling all at once. And it means that there's always something interesting going on. So you just want to take one more turn just so I can complete this loop, right? Humans are natural completionists, right? There's this idea of there's a name for it too, where this idea that like if you have something that's mostly completed, like if you've got some kind of completion bar that's at 90%, you really just want to close that loop. So it's like, all right, I'll just play one more turn so I can close this one loop, but then there's another loop that's about to close, and then another, and then another. So it really exploits that that kind of brain hack of human psychology, that we really like to close loops. And the problem is that it's just, as soon as you close a loop, it opens a new one, which will pay off, 10 turns from now. But now you've got something else that's paying off 1 or 2 turns from now. And then you just, oh, let me close that one too. And that's how this happens. I want to also talk about, why Machinations? So Machinations is this tool that's, used to diagram and simulate resource flow through a game. So when I was thinking about we were, like I said, we were talking about, okay, what kind of game should I be doing a machination for? And I thought, all right, what kind of game would I want to model here? All right, the ideal case for where Machinations really shines are games that are very systems heavy, especially if it's something that's just not easy to do in a spreadsheet because you've got multiple interconnected systems. And so I thought, all right, 4X is kind of the poster child for multiple interconnected systems and extreme complexity that doesn't just go really well in a spreadsheet. I mean, I have used spreadsheets to figure these things out before, but it's usually like 10 different worksheets that all are interconnected with each other, and you have to be really careful to avoid circular references. Most 4X games are just obnoxiously complicated, right? That's one of the selling points to the game's core audience. And the other thing I like about this tool is that of Machinations is that you can model a game system at just about any level of abstraction, right? You can hand wave over things and treat an entire system that's really complicated as just like, oh, this is a simple black box and it just spits out a number. Every now and then, or you can build that out to get extremely detailed and intricate, modeling that exact system down to the smallest number, or anywhere in between. All depends on how much time you want to spend on your diagram and how precise you want your simulation to be. So 4X games are kind of this intricate thing, which really lend itself well to saying, well, we could do a really abstract model, or we could do a really intricate, detailed model, or anywhere in between. And you can even have combinations of things where you have like some really detailed systems and then some systems that are extremely abstract that are just, abstracted away. So, all right, so let's actually start by taking a simple diagram of a 4X game. And we'll just start by building the simplest model we possibly can. I'm not modeling a specific game. I'm just modeling, here's a generic, fictional 4X. That way I didn't have to worry about like looking up specific details about one game. So in our game, let's start with, we'll do an exploration system, a city building system, an economic system, a tech system, and a combat system. So let's start with, we have a map and there's fog of war and you can explore it. So for our purposes, let's just treat this as the percent of world explored. So we'll have 2 pools, one for percent of the world that's unexplored and one for percent that's explored. And we'll start at 99. Yeah, we'll start at let's start at 99 for unexplored and 1 for explored, because we do have a map that we usually start with like 1 unit on a map that just shows us a tiny bit of it, right? So, and now we have a means to take things from unexplored to explored. How do we bring unexplored land into the realm of explored? Well, usually we do that by moving units around on a map. So this does not actually explore on its own. So that number right there should probably, on the arrow should probably be 0. Right, because land doesn't explore itself, right? Instead you have units move around the map. So let's create another pool for the number of units you have. And let's say that units can explore each turn. And let's say, just for simplicity, that that each unit can explore 1% of the map per turn. So the number of units is going to give a +1 to that thing. Yeah. And we can start with, like, say, 1 unit. Right. So that means, each n units move n tokens from % unexplored to explored every turn. So yeah, so this is our basic unit. You have 1 unit and it is exploring the world. That's not very interesting yet, but we've got that. So, all right, so how do we add more units? Well, usually we use city production to build them if we aren't using that production to build upgrades to the cities themselves. So we need some kind of cities, but in most of these games, we don't really have this it's like you can either have large cities or small cities, and you might have like 25 small cities with 1 population each, or 1 big city with 25 population. And usually that's relatively balanced with each other. So really, instead of worrying about individual cities and having the player make more cities, let's just look at population. So we'll create another pool, and we'll call that just total population. And that'll be spread among some number of cities, and we're going to abstract the idea of cities in general. Right, so we have total population. So now we have a population pool, and basically this is going to be our overall driver of growth throughout our entire empire. Now we could do exponential population growth. That's how it works in the real world, but that's in these games it's usually pretty extreme, and they usually actually go either linear or logarithmic. So that you don't have these population explosions. So let's just approximate it by saying, let's create a source off of population and just have it gain a constant +1 population over time. So your population is growing at a linear rate. So now we have a growing population. The population doesn't do anything yet, but it will. All right, so what does population let you do? Well, usually it lets you do a few things. It increases your production in your cities, which lets you then upgrade your cities to do all kinds of things, lets you produce military units, and it upgrades your tech and your economy. And usually you can micromanage your cities to decide what population is focusing on. So we won't do that for now, but what we will do is have the population put a few tokens in a few pools. So let's create a few more pools down here. Production, money, and tech. So let's create those like right around here. Right, because our population is going to be right. Oh yeah, so that's right. So yeah, so that's fine. Yeah, so production, money, and tech. And the source is, and so we've got a source here that's going to currently send 0. This should send 0 per turn automatically times there. Right, but it's going to be increased by your population. Right, so again, your population is going to so each point of population you have is going to increase this, and it's going to split these things. Let's say just kind of equally between production, money, and tech. Right, so this would cause population to increase all 3 of these as it grows, and because population is growing linearly, these things are going to explode in the short term. If we were balancing this thing carefully, then we'd probably want to change that. But for now, let's go ahead and do that. So yeah, so there's 1, 2, 3. Yep, and so then so these things are going to grow by your population. Okay. So now we have production, we have money, we have tech. What do these things do? So let's focus on production first. So you didn't have to zoom in, but I just meant that's the thing we're going to do. So production lets you do 2 things. It lets you upgrade your cities, and it lets you build your military units. So let's say that it costs, say 5 production to create 1 unit. So yeah, so we're going to make an exchanger here that has a 5 to 1. So now we've got right. So now we can right, and let's put that under player control. So the player can click on this thing in order to convert production into units. So you can spend 5 production in order to make a unit. Upgrading cities is a little bit trickier since there are usually lots of ways to upgrade a city in these games, and each one has kind of its own hard-coded special ability. Generally, it improves something the city does. It makes it more efficient in some way. So here we can model that by saying, let's create a city upgrades pool. That's and let's make that cost 5 production as well. Right, so you can spend 5 production to build a unit, or you could spend 5 production to create a city upgrade. And let's say that what a city upgrade does is it increases the number of pulls per turn from population. So it's actually going to make your population 10%, let's say 10% more efficient per upgrade. Right, so right, so this would be like a plus 0.1. So yes, we deal with integer values. That means that once our total population gets to say 10, then this thing will give you a free one. Right, so for each city upgrade. Right, so you can actually have these dashed arrows affecting dashed arrows. So oh, this should actually be, this probably shouldn't be a plus 0.1. It should be like a times 0.1.
That's doing the same thing.
Okay. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. No, you're right. Okay, you're right. I see. So that handles production. So now we can look at money. Money is usually in these games this versatile thing that can just be turned into other resources, and so you can use it as kind of a means of exchange. But for now, let's just assume in this game that money is just you can use it to pay to rush production. So you could just use an activated click to send your money to production. Right, so let's say 1 money becomes 1 production. That isn't very interesting in this diagram because we're at too abstract of a layer. So it's just like, all right, money and production basically are the same at this level. But I'm just putting this in here. The actual game, it's more nuanced because you can decide when to spend money, and you can decide on what order, on which thing to rush production, so that you can get specific things when you need them. Right, so for now, this is just kind of this offshoot thing. We'll just keep it in here in the simulation. It's not really adding a whole lot, but we could build this out to a more, it's there so that we could build it out to a more nuanced thing later on if we needed to. So now let's look at tech. So tech is this another thing that's kind of like city upgrades, where there's some kind of tech tree or tech ladder where each new tech that you unlock gives you some unique set of things. New special abilities, increased stats like rate of population or money or production or tech gain or whatever. Each tech is usually very different from the others, and they generally get more expensive the more of them you have. But then your population is also probably growing, so you're able to produce more tech. So it usually, the total number of turns it takes you to get a new tech is usually about the same, as you over time, but it's because your tech gain is increasing and the cost of a new tech is increasing too. So we could model this a few ways. One would be to have different focuses for different techs, but for now, let's just say that let's treat all techs as the same, and they all make your empire just a little more efficient in every way. So we're going to have this a new pool over here, which is like unlocked techs. So these are things that we right. So unlocked text is going to do all these things. And for simplicity, we'll just do it that way. So our pool of tech, so this is like our pool of tech points or science research or something like that. And then you can use that to kind of buy a tech. And this gets more expensive over time. Right. So this is going to be like the first one might cost 1, and then each additional one costs more. Right. So yeah, so we could have that be plus 5 is fine. Right. So the first one costs 1, then the next one costs 6, the next one costs 11, and so on. So these are just getting more expensive over time. Right. And so, what do unlock texts do? Let's say these increase the your population gain by like 25%. Right, so this is gonna like affect that thing over there. Right, why population gain? I mean, that's not really what most texts do, but since population is the total driver of the health of our entire and growth of our entire empire, changing this number, changing your rate of population growth is basically a cheap way of saying, I'm going to abstract that tech is just going to make everything better. We'll also have unlock techs increase our military strength once we implement the concept of a military. But this is kind of a way to say, this is our population is like at the beginning of the chain that everything else expands from. So if we have our tech affecting that, basically it's a way of saying we are abstracting our tech away to say it's affecting everything. And it's just making our entire empire more efficient. I think Mo was saying you want to stop and take a breather and just reflect for a bit before I move on.
Yeah, so I think this is super interesting so far. And one of the things I'd like to touch upon is you were saying, as humans, we love to close loops. And every time a loop closes, another loop opens. And what's really interesting about 4X is that, because there's all these different loops going on in parallel, within each loop, there's also some very interesting choices for a player to make just by the design of the game. So, in military, for example, the different kinds of units that you can, build. You might have someone that, is more of a combat unit. You might have a builder unit. You might have a ranged combat unit, a melee combat unit, and that's just within, the army. With tech, you have, do you want to go Navy? Do you want to go, explore Navy or attack Navy? Do you want to, focus more on your land units? So within every, subsystem or loop, there's a series of interesting decisions that the player has to make. So, it's also about this idea of stopping and reflecting at the end of every loop. And when you come to start a new one, it's sort of about, how would, this decision, play with my overall strategy. And because, there's so many things going on in parallel, it's usually very hard to mathematically calculate that. And so the meta is sort of hidden. And it's up to you to sort of like gut feel your best instinct and try to work with an overall strategy. So I was sort of wanting to take your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with anything you say here. Yeah, so I mean, and the other thing is, because 4X games have, that is worth pointing out here is that because 4X games have lots of loops in them, that's one thing I like about these kinds of just, resource flow diagrams in general, is that, you can visually see where all the loops are. You can see which loops are really tight, and you can see which loops are really, kind of long-term. Right, and you can see like visually where the loops are. I like being able to visualize that, because then when then it's like it's usually pretty obvious to see where your core game loop is, because that's the loop that's like at the center of the diagram that everything else is revolving around and affecting. Right, so in this case, it's like everything is kind of leading back to this section of the of the diagram. So it's like okay, population growth really is kind of the main thing here, and you can which is true in most 4X games. It's like, and you can increase population by doing really good exploiting of resources in order to drive population growth as fast as possible. You can do it by expanding, by getting more cities, and with each city increasing its population. You can do it through military takeover, like I'll just take your city, I take all the population that's in it, minus anyone that I accidentally killed with my tanks on while I was rolling in. Right, so it's like you can see where all the loops are. And that also gives you kind of some advanced warning, because everything that is a closed loop in a game has the potential to be like a positive feedback loop, or negative feedback loop if you've got some negatives on there. Right. Positive feedback loops aren't necessarily unbalanced, but that's one of the things when you're balancing a game that you usually want to keep a very careful eye on, because those things can snowball and just kind of explode in your face if you're not careful. So this also gives you kind of an early warning system of these are the kinds of things that you want to pay close attention to. Like for those of you that noticed, there's this, feedback loop, here of just, more production gets you more population growth, which gets you more production. And right now, just because population is increasing your production linearly, right, this thing explodes very, very fast. If I were balancing this game, I would want to be putting the brakes on this a lot. This might be like an integer division by like 20 or something like that, just to keep it down low in the early game before it explodes in the late game. We're not going to do that here, but we could definitely do stuff like that. Also, before I go on, I'll ask, has anyone been monitoring the chat? Like, are there any questions from the audience that that we should address now before going on? Because I don't want someone to be like, I am completely lost. I have no idea what you're doing here. And I don't want you to hold those questions to the end, because then you're just going to get more lost before we get there.
So yeah, there's a quick question in the chat, which is related to the core loops. Marwan in the chat was asking, are they permanent, or can you iterate on them, later in development?
So usually when designing a game, the core loop is one of the first things you want to design, just because that's the thing that's at the very center. That's the moment-to-moment gameplay. And so if you don't know what that is, what it is that the player is doing on a moment-to-moment basis, then what even is your game, right? I'm not saying that every game starts out that way. Some games start out by saying, I want to tell a certain story, for example. And then I have to kind of reverse engineer, okay, what kinds of mechanics are going to be most suitable to telling that story? But usually figuring out your core loop is done very, very early in the process. Figuring out all the other loops that surround that and what are the other subsystems and peripheral things that feed into it, those can sometimes happen a bit later in development. And also, one nice thing about a diagram like this is sometimes, I know some systems designers, I'm definitely vulnerable to this myself, that designing intricate, complex systems of systems that feed into each other is the fun part. And we tend to kind of over-engineer and over-complicate things, and just make these systems that are just these massive things that this feeds into this, feeds into this, feeds into this, and it's so complicated that even the designer has no idea what's actually going on. Laying out a diagram like this, number one, makes it easier to bring like new designers on the team up to speed to say like, oh, okay, here's what the game actually is. It's good for the lead designer or systems designers to really be able to see a bird's eye view of, okay, this is where the game is, and this is kind of what's going on. And also it's good to see like if there's something that's hanging out on the edge that's not really affecting anything. Like in this case right now, as it is, we have this whole concept of exploration that's not doing anything, right? So this is like completely disconnected from everything else on the map right now. And so that's a good way that, if you've built out a complete diagram of a game and you find there's something over here that's not really involved in anything else and doesn't really feed into any other systems, that's a way that you can say like, okay, maybe I need to add another loop here. But yeah, usually your core loop is one of the first things that you design and one of the first things that you diagram out, because you want to make that work first. That's where the player's like spending 99% of their time in your game. You want that to be compelling. Do we have any other questions from chat before I move on?
I think we're good.
All right. So let's talk about combat and exploration and stuff like that. So in the world, there are some other players. We don't have other players diagrammed here yet, so let's fix them. So different games vary on how many players are in the game. For this case, let's say there are 4 other players. So how do we interact with them? So the first thing we have to do when we're meeting a new player is we have to actually discover that a player is there. And that's where this exploration comes into play. So let's say that if there's 4 players that we discover each one when we've discovered 25% of the map. So when we explore 25%, so when our exploration gets up to at least 25, we've explored, we've got one player. At 50, we've found a second player. At 75, we found a third, and at 100, we found the fourth. So we can just probably treat this as like a register equal to % explored. Yeah, and that's just going to be the floor of this over 25. So when this gets to 25, our register goes to 1, and it'll eventually go up to a maximum of 4 when this is all explored. And this just tells us how many opponents we have discovered. Right. So so this is kind of our discovered players register. And then we should be able to attack these other players using our military units. So we should have like an enemy. So what you're creating here already, getting ahead of me, is these enemy units pools. And this is just how much of a military the enemy has. Each of these 4 other players have. So this is player 1, player 2, player 3, player 4. Right. And so we'll create, and so we're also creating these 4 sinks. And what we're saying is, all right, if you click on this sink, let's say that we take 5 units from the enemy and 5 units from us. Right. So these numbers here and these numbers here should all be 5. Right. And you also added a source on here, just saying like, our enemy AI right now is that each enemy is gaining 1 unit per turn. Right. Right. So our opponents are getting stronger over time, just as we are. Right. And so now we have these 4 sinks, and if you click on any of them, then it just we trade 5 of our units for 5 of their units. Right, but we should only be able to do that if we have discovered that player. Right, so this one should only be clickable if this if our discovered players over here is greater than 0. This one should be if it's greater than 1, greater than 2, greater than 3. Right. So then these things will be disabled until we've discovered enough of the map to find these people. We should also have some kind of benefit of attacking. Like, let's say when you attack, you also get something. Usually when you attack, you're also attacking to take over a city. So let's say maybe every time you click one of these sinks, you also gain, let's say it also gains like +1 population. Right, so all of these are also going to create a source that then just, right, and then that's just going to feed into the total population down there. We could also probably give some kind of bonus when you eliminate a player entirely, but instead let's just have, let's have 2 things here. One is that a player, these opponents up here, should stop generating units if you've reduced their units to 0. So let's say when you reduce your units to 0, that what this is doing is that essentially means they have been eliminated from the game. Right. So this has to be greater than 0. Right. And then and so all of these should work that way. And then we should probably have some kind of victory condition, so some kind of end state here. That just says if all 4 of these are 0, then the game ends. And so that's a military victory. And I think when we were kind of going over this earlier, we found there was a little problem with that, where because these things are generating +1 per turn, then when you even when you clicked on this and emptied it, it was still getting 1 on the same tick, which meant that these were never actually seen as empty. So that's why we're changing these to like a, every 2 turns. You need to do that on this one too. Right, so they're generating 1 every 2 turns instead of just every turn, so that every other turn there's this will work 50% of the time, basically. We could slow it down even more if we wanted to.
We can have the starting troops be at 1 and treat the 1 as the 0, as in condition not with greater than 0 but greater than 1. So when they run out.
Yep. Yeah, 50% of the time, 100% of the time it works. I just realized another way we could do that might be more elegant would be to start these all at 2 and then have this be greater than 0. So that way, even if it goes down to 0 and goes back up to 1, it'll still, it'll always stop and consider itself dead. So we could do it that way too. So now, I promised before that tech should also improve your combat capability, right? So right now, it's just when you enter a combat, it costs you 5 military units to their 5 military units. But we can make that based on your tech instead. So let's say instead that this costs 10 of your military units. So it starts off inefficient, right? It costs me 10 units to kill 5 of yours, but let's say it costs you 10 of yours, and let's say it costs 5 plus n enemy units, where n is your tech. So what we have is we want our unlocked techs, right, to go up here and basically add 1 to each of these for each of your unlocked techs. So it'll take me 10 to initiate combat. But eventually, to take 5 of yours, if I have 5 tech, then it's going to be 10 for 10. If I have 20 tech, then I'll be 10 for 25. So eventually this will outpace you if I max out my tech. I could also implement a tech level for the opponents that goes up periodically, but I'm leaving that out for now. So now we have like a pretty decent combat system that is affected by tech. We could, so we have a military victory. So we could also add a tech victory. That one's pretty easy. We could just have something an end condition down where the tech is, that just says like, oh, when you get to say 30 unlocked techs, then you just win a tech victory. So that's a pretty easy one to add. And then we could also add another victory condition, like say, usually there's some kind of like cultural victory where you build, or economic victory where you like build some game-ending wonder that costs a massive amount of production. So maybe there's something that costs like say 1,000 production. So in addition to this build unit and city upgrade, there's another one that costs say like 1,000, and you trigger it to get costs 1,000 production to get 1 wonder, and that 1 wonder also triggers the end game through some kind of cultural or economic victory or something like that. Right. So now we have more or less a fully functional, very, very basic and very abstracted 4X game that has multiple victory conditions. Oh wait, where's the tech should the unlocked tech should also have a greater than 30 victory condition there. So now we have 30, right? So now we have 3 different victory conditions. We've got all the main systems of a very basic 4X game. But each of these things is very abstract, like units, for example, is very abstract. So this is so I want to give an example of how you could take this very, very abstract diagram and start adding more detail. So units is an obvious place where we could add more detail here. There are usually dozens of different unit types, but they generally specialize in different things. So like some specialize in exploration, like scouting. Others are good at attacking or defending. They have different combat stats. They have different costs to create. Sometimes they have upkeep costs, which we're not taking into account right now. Right. So we could absolutely do an upkeep cost very easily by just having the having money, units drain money every single turn. But let's not do that yet. But and maybe units are differentiated by like land versus sea versus air, right? So if we wanted to, we could take this one pool right here and just flesh it out to give more detail. So let's, as an example, let's do that. Let's take this pool and let's create 2 more, units pools here. So we're going to have 3 different kinds of units. So let's say this one, let's say our military units, because it's hooked up the most to this this whole military subsystem. Right. So these are our military units, and then let's have another set type of unit that's like exploration units, and we'll just move this this exploration thing over to that one. Right, and then we'll have a third type that say settler units. So those are the ones that will create new cities. Right, and a settler is just creating a new population center. So let's say that just that just converts 1-to-1 to population, right? So let's say this settler unit just automatically drains into population. When you get a settler unit, it becomes a new +1 population, and that happens just automatically every turn. You have a settler, it becomes population, right? So right, and then building unit, and then this build unit thing here, right? We should have like 3 build unit things, right? One that creates military, one that creates explorer, one that creates settler. We can make them the same cost for now. Right, so now we have, yes, right, so now you can actually choose which type of unit to build. Right, you can build one, right, you can build your military units that you use to fight stuff. You can build an explorer unit that's used to explore the map, or you could build settler units that just give you population directly. Right, so now we've taken this system of units, and it's still very abstract. Like usually there are still like dozens of types of military units, different types of units that can explore. Usually you can use military units to do some form of exploration. Right, so there is some overlap here, right, but this is at least less abstract than what we had before, where everything was just in units. Right, so this takes that system and makes it a little bit more detailed. Right, we could also say something like, what if percent explored has some kind of, it probably has some kind of economic benefit. Like if you explored the world, you probably found all the best resources, all the best sites to build towns on, which is going to improve your production. So we might do that by just having like a dashed arrow from percent explored to to your actual production pipeline here, that just maybe makes it where like say 10% of your explored. So maybe like each one of these improves your production by 0.1 again. So that way, so you could add that. Right, or you could have something where like percent explored makes your settler units more effective, where they, instead of giving you +1 pop, they give you like +1 population for every 20% explored, right? Right, so you could do something like that, where settlers become more efficient because you've explored more of the map, so that doing that. Right, and I still want this to happen instantly and automatically, just that buying late game settlers after exploring will be more effective, but you'll have less time for them to grow, so it's kind of a trade-off. And that is the case in many 4X games too, that you spend the early part of the game exploring and expanding, and then you kind of shift into into whatever your primary victory condition is in the late game. And we could flesh out another system. Like you could easily see, I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to, right, but you could see where like tech right now is just this single thing. And you could see where we might be able to say, flesh out this unlock text thing to maybe say, there are different kinds of tech. Right, so we could say, there are, so don't make any changes to this, but you could say like, maybe we have military focused tech and population growth of focused tech, and tech generation focused tech that makes you gain more tech faster and stuff like that. And you could maybe make like 3 or 4 different types of tech, and then have the player choose, which one this goes into, so that they can choose how their empire is growing at different stages of the game. Right, you could also, you could also expand out units to your military units to maybe say like there are early game, mid game, and late game units, with later ones being much more effective, but also requiring a certain tech level in order to purchase in the first place. Right, and so the point here, what I want you to see here isn't like here's how to make a 4X game in Machinations. Really, it's just that you can target your layers of abstraction here. So you can go hyper detailed into some systems of the game while leaving the rest of these as kind of stubs or that just give you the basic output of a black box. All depends on your needs, right? So if you were, say, working at 4Axis and you have that size budget, you might actually build out like all the systems of civilization in extreme detail in this thing, and have like a complete simulation of everything that's extremely high fidelity. And then you could just, change like a single number here in order to balance things and see how things were going. You could totally do that. But that would, if you were doing that just as like, I'm a Civ fan and I want to build a simulation of Civ 6 in here on my own, it would probably take you a while. But you could at least abstract it out to say like, okay, here's a general simulation of this thing, to try to look for imbalances or just to try to, get a general sense of here's what's going on. Another place where you could abstract out is this thing right here. You've got these four other players that are doing basically nothing but just generating constant military turn. You could have each of these players have an entire diagram like this that is under AI control, where they are building up their cities, building up their tech, and building up their military at the same time. And now you're, and maybe they have game end conditions as well, right? So on top of that, so while you have 3 won the game things here, maybe there's all of these people are pointing to their own separate won the game thing here, where other players can win a military victory or a thing. Right now, right now your military is entirely under your control. They never attack you. You could totally have it where every now and then, if one of these players has like a much larger number of units than you, they'll just send some over and start kicking your butt. So you don't have to do any of that here, but I'm just saying, the point is that you can add on to this thing. Right, so we started with this diagram really we started with this diagram here, that just 3 pools, and we built it out and we built it out and we built it out, and you could continue building this more or less indefinitely, just adding detail to whatever places you want to simulate. And if you say like, all right, I don't really care about what my opponents are doing, really I want to simulate more about the empire building element of this, you can totally do that and just leave this exactly where it is, and kind of build out a lot more detail here. Or if you want to say, no, I really want more detail on what my opponents are doing, you could build these things out and leave the rest of the stuff alone. So that's kind of where we're going with this. So with that, I'll say let's open it up to audience questions, comments, kind of however you all want to do this thing.
So I have a question right here, actually. So when it comes to balancing, is it better to balance as you build or balance in large chunks after you build?
So I usually say that, game balance is going to look, the tasks of game balance and what you're doing with game balance looks different depending on what stage of development you're in. Right, early stage balance is going to look very different. I usually say, so when you change the core mechanics of your game, right? Early on, your main task as a systems designer is to make a compelling core game loop, right? And to just build out all the systems and make sure that they are actually fun, they're engaging, whatever your design goal is for the game, that your core loop is satisfying that. And whenever the core mechanics of the game change, all of the balance work that you've done gets thrown out the window, because all the numbers suddenly mean different things now that you've changed, how the game actually works, right? So hand tweaking and getting the balance perfect on like all these numbers and all this tuning early on is more or less a complete waste of time, because you're going to have to redo that later. I won't say complete waste, because you going through that, you will get a better intuition for how these numbers affect each other. But I'd say usually it's not worth your time to get too detailed in that. The one thing I will say is that if your game is so far out of balance that it prevents you from effectively testing your core mechanics, then you're going to need to fix that. and usually the good news is that usually if your balance is that far off, it's going to be so egregious that it's going to be really bloody obvious. Right, your players are going to complain about it, you're going to notice about it, right? If I've got 5 systems in the game and players are only engaging just with tech because they found that that's the broken strategy and it's not even worth engaging with anything else, then yeah, you're not going to really be able to get a sense for whether your economic loop or whether your military loop or whatever are interesting, because everyone's ignoring it because tech is OP. So in that case, you'll want to just give some pretty serious nerfs to that in order to let the other mechanics of the game shine. But you're not going to need to get it perfect. You just need to get it good enough that every single playtester isn't whining about it. Once you're getting to the point where the playtesters aren't universally saying this thing is OP, please nerf, then you're good enough for early stage design. And then at that point, what you're doing, like when you're building out this machinations diagram, part of what this is doing is you're not using this early stage to balance the game, but it is giving you the simulation tools you will need to balance the game later, because this will tell you, like, all right, what is one population worth compared to +1 tech, right? How do you balance those two things? Later on, you're gonna have to do that kind of balance, right? Usually that kind of numbers tweaking happens in the late stages of the game, where where your core mechanics are pretty much set in stone. That they're working, and now you're just dealing with the detail work of getting the right numbers for all the other systems. And at that point, you are going to want to know, like, what's more powerful, +1 money per turn or +1 tech per turn, or are those two things the same? What about what about an upgrade that gives you a permanent +5 money per turn to your empire versus one that gives all of your military units +1 strength? Well, being able to relate all those things to each other is important, and that's where, like, some kind of systems diagram that shows you what the numeric relations are between all the different things, so that you can kind of choose one kind of anchor point to say, like, this one thing is like our baseline, and then we're going to put everything else in the game in numeric terms of that thing, and then that thing is going to mediate the things between there. So if you choose, say, something like population as your anchor that everything is related to, then you say, okay, well, if I know that 1 tech is worth 5 population, and I know that 1 strong military unit is worth 2 population, then I know that this is a 2-to-5 ratio between these two things over here. Right. So building out this diagram isn't for the purpose of early stage balance. It is for the purpose of making your balance tasks easier later on, because you'll actually have a working mathematical model of how everything is related to everything else.
Right. So that's perfect. But I do have a second question from the audience, which is, how would you handle balance, for procedurally generated maps with different pieces, for example? We're delving deep into.
Yeah. Oh, ProcGen, balancing ProcGen. I could write like an entire book on just that, right? That's hard, right? So a little history lesson, right? There was a time, I'd say probably 10 or 15 years ago or so, where ProcGen was like this really hot topic in the game industry. And the reason was because it's like, oh, you can, if we can just have the computer do this for us, that means we don't have to have handcrafted content, right? So it's like we pay 1 flat upfront cost to create content, and then we're done. Whereas if you wanted to create, say, new content on a regular ongoing basis by hand, that's like a linear cost that is just ongoing forever. Right. So it seemed like procedural generation was like the future. Everyone was going to be doing this, because now we'll know we won't need content designers anymore. We'll just automate that entire process. And what we found is that procedural generation has a very, very high upfront cost. And the reason is because of exactly that, because like, how do you balance that? But when the computer is doing things on your behalf, how do you ensure that it's doing things that make sense and that it's not giving you, say, like a 4X map where everyone starts on a tiny island and there's nothing to do, and you all just sit there starving to death in the early game. Right, it's like, how do you balance that kind of thing? Right, AI is a lot the same way. It's like, how do you balance an AI where the internal system of the AI is kind of this complex thing that's mostly unknown? The answer is that, it's tricky, and it takes a lot of time to get it feeling good. Usually the way it works with both AI and with ProcGen is that we don't have great tools for balancing these things, just because the inside is such a complex system that you don't always even completely fully understand how it's doing what it's doing. What we do is what we do is you'll build your best guess as to one of these systems. There are some game designers out there that are just really, really good at that kind of AI design, and you get better at it as you go. But even if you have someone who's mediocre at that thing, they'll throw together a system, and then you'll run it. And you'll do a lot of play testing on it, and you'll find out that sometimes it does something that's really, really, really stupid, that you just never ever want it to do in release. And you're like, all right, we've got this map right here. Very often you'll have things like a random number seed that is displayed on the screen, and you'll want to write that seed down so that you can recreate it and step through in something like a debugger to figure out what the heck happened here. How did it do that thing? Right. So you'll run it a bunch of times, and you'll say, all right, are any of these maps just really bad? Okay, we found one. What was the random number seed of that? Okay, let's step through and figure out, how did it get there? What did it do? And then you can say, all right, how do we stop it from doing that stupid thing ever again? And then you fix it, and then you do it again, right? And you keep doing that until people stop complaining. And then you call it close enough. That's generally how AI works. That's generally how ProcGen works. Is you get it to the point where people stop complaining about it, and then you say that's good enough. That's all. I think that's also mostly how game audio works. I'm not an audio person, but same thing. Right? It's like, your audio is good when people aren't complaining about the audio.